Good evening, everybody. Hello. Good evening. My name is Jacinta Thompson, and I'm the Executive Director and Events and Exhibitions Producer for the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre. Now, before we begin, I would like to ask Uncle Frank Wanganeen, Ghana and Narungga Elder. He will provide the welcome to country for all of us. Thank you, Uncle Frank.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be today, and particularly with our guests here doing the talks. I'm really looking forward to hearing what they have to say. So now I just do the welcome in the Ghana language. Nai tampati tuulu brekiana, nai tampati bamba belyarendi Ghana yurtiana, martaji younger Ghana miana, nai wangani mani nai budni Ghana yurtiana, tanda younger wadliana. So what I just said in the Ghana language is I just want to acknowledge the ancestors and also recognise Wari Oldens, the vendors on Ghana country, and on behalf of all the Ghana people, I welcome you all to Tarndanyanga, the place of the red kangaroo. So Nataya, I hope you have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Uncle Frank. Now, unfortunately, Dr Debra Dank is unable to join us in person this evening due to that horrible cyclone currently impacting Queensland and northern New South Wales. We were aiming to Zoom Deb in for this event, but obviously that is not manageable now. So she has provided some notes for us. Wesley has those in his hot little hand, and sorry, I shouldn't say little, hot hand. It's going to go well, I can feel it, which will be incorporated into tonight's conversation. Tonight we are joined by Rachel Perkins, award-winning film and television director and producer, along with Daniel Riley, Artistic Director of the Australian Dance Theatre. And a warm welcome to you both. Thank you so much for joining us. And Daniel, thank you for coming along with such short notice. They will be in conversation with writer and director, Professor Wesley Enoch AM. Wesley, I'm thrilled that you are actually finally here with us at the Hawke Centre. It's taken a few years. And just to mention that Wesley and I worked together at Sydney Theatre Company. Wesley, it was over 25 years ago. And we haven't changed a bit. I'm really absolutely thrilled to be presenting tonight's event in partnership with WOMADelaide's Planet Talks, and I would like to thank Rob Law and your team for all your support. So great to be collaborating again. The session tonight is being recorded and a video will be available on the Hawke Centre website next week. I encourage you to bring this to the attention of friends and colleagues who could not join us tonight. We are also live streaming this presentation, and I welcome our online audience of just over 300, and thank you for joining us. As we are filming, can I please ask that you switch your phones to silent to avoid interruptions. So to introduce Wesley, Wesley has written and directed iconic Indigenous productions, including The 7 Stages of Grieving, Black Medea, and The Story of the Miracles at Cookie's Table. He was the Artistic Director of Sydney Festival from 2017 to 2020 and was previously the Artistic Director at Kuwemba Jadara Indigenous Performing Arts and Ildeberry Theatre Company. So please join me in welcoming Wesley, Rachel and Daniel for what promises to be an insightful and heartfelt conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacinta. Thank you, Uncle Frank. Thank you, Rob, too, for your support in this talk. And thank you for making the time to come to this particular talk tonight. We were talking earlier about, Rachel says, oh no, if they all turn up. She says, people don't turn up.
Yeah, I was so surprised. I was like, there's people outside. And he was like, yeah, there's people coming. I'm like, really, there's people coming? And he's like, yeah. And I was like, oh, I'm so used to people not coming to things. Well, so thank you for coming.
And the story...
Things that I'm involved with anyway, not you're involved with me,
No.
Anyway.
But the story I told too was I was talking to an elder from Brisbane, Auntie Cheryl Buchanan, who was instrumental in a lot of the conversation about Black Power and the Black Panther movement and the Tribal Council in Brisbane in the 70s. And she talked about those early moments where only 100 people would do these protests in the streets. And, and there'd be terrible kind of outnumbering by the police and all that stuff. But by the time the 80s and then the 90s and now, there are tens of thousands of people that walk those streets. And she said that the story gets through.
Yep, showing up makes a difference.
Yeah.
Showing up.
And showing what you care about makes a difference as well. And Daniel, great to have you here, even though you aren't wearing socks today.
No, I'm not wearing socks
I'm not wearing
today.
socks either.
Oh.
You're the one out, actually. You're the odd one out, yeah.
Apparently every time I talk to Daniel, I talk about his lack of socks. So
Every time.
I'm sorry about that.
That's okay.
And of course, Daniel's got a show on at the Australian Dance Theatre as part of the festival that closes tomorrow.
Tomorrow, yes.
So we'll talk a little bit about that, storytelling through dance in particular.
Love to.
Poor Deborah. I grew up in Brisbane. I live on Stradbroke Island, which, if you see that map, straight through that island, and I'm ringing my family every moment saying, "Oh, watch out for that bin. Put that bin somewhere," And I was talking to my 70-year-old aunt who used to live in the Torres Strait and lived in Cairns for a long time, and she said, "Oh, don't worry, it's only going to be Category 2." And you're going, what? So there's a lot of stuff there. But also terrible that Deborah couldn't make it down. As it is, apparently I'm going to be here until Sunday. So open for invitations if there's... if there's there's plenty of things to see in Adelaide during the Adelaide Festival, so I'm sure I'm not going to be at a loose end for too long. But what a terrible thing. Isn't it terrible that tomorrow is International Women's Day and it's being upstaged by a male cyclone? That's just wrong. Oh yeah, thank you. I practiced that joke and Rachel said, no, that's not going to work. You've got to do this. So I did,
He did it
hone
anyway,
a bit more.
so I was like, oh yeah, that's sort of mildly funny, but I
Here we
wouldn't do
are.
it if I was you, but he did it, But he's a director, right? So he's going to do what he wants. Yeah.
I reckon if I do lower expectations, then you can rise to the dizzy
We'll
heights.
see how you go. Yeah, we'll see.
Well, tonight we're actually talking a lot about the power of story and the story that can shape a future. We've joked about it, but this notion of where you come from, how you connect to story, and even as we started here, having Uncle Frank welcome us again. I imagine many people have felt welcomed and been welcomed on a number of occasions, but that welcome is an incredible reiteration of story that happens and is a necessity to happen so that we can feel part of this bigger kind of sense of who we are. For me, I'm Wesley James Enoch. Wesley after the Methodist ministers, James after the apostle. Enoch comes from Genesis 26 and given to our family by missionaries 7 generations ago. And so this notion of the story of our history is in my name. Mm-hmm. And I, as Jacinta said, all those other things, but Quandamooka people, the Nugi people of the Quandamooka, Jandai speaking. And so there's those different layers of identity there as well. When people say, what are you? People say Jandai, some people say Quandamooka, some people say Nugi, and you go, all things can be simultaneously true at the same time.
Yes.
There is no one identity. There's no one way of being. And so on my father's side of the family, I have a great-great-great-grandfather named Fernando Gonzalez.
Wesley Gonzalez.
Wesley Gonzalez, Speedy.
Yeah,
Hot
like
and
that.
Speedy. But
You're really taking that hot thing on, aren't you?
I'm owning it. I'm owning
you
it.
really are. Yeah.
But the idea of going, and he was a Filipino fisherman who came to Stradbroke Island and got shipwrecked on the island and all those kind of things. And then another great-grandfather named Fataki or Fataraki, and from Rotorua Island in the South Pacific, who was blackbirded and came to the island and part of the fishing communities and things. And on my mother's side of the family, I love telling, and my mother's side of the family is the white side of the family, and I lovingly call them the white trash side of the family.
I wonder what they call you.
The black sheep, nah.
Yes.
But the idea of my Danish great-grandmother who met my Spanish great-grandfather after World War I coming to this country to find a place of peace. And so you just find all of these amazing, and I should just say, I call them lovingly the white trash. My great-grandfather was a SB bookmaker and sold sly grog from the the bottom gate of the house and all those kind of things, and at one point had a racehorse that got shot by a mobster. Anyway, we are the stories we tell about ourselves. It's no accident that if you don't have a story of who you are, you don't belong anywhere. If you don't understand how you fit 7 generations back or further, it's hard to imagine a future. That stories have this way of connecting us to where we come from and who we are. I'm going to come to you, Daniel. Sure. How do you identify yourself? What are the stories you tell about who you are?
Yeah, so hello everybody, good evening. My name is Daniel Riley. I can trace my Wiradjuri ancestry back through my paternal line, so through my grandfather, back to Dubbo area, so Western New South Wales. The Wiradjuri land is one of the biggest which is traditional land along the East Coast, if you're not aware of that. I didn't grow up on country. I didn't grow up surrounded by my community. I didn't grow up speaking language. I didn't grow up learning my dance form. I'm an urban black fella. I have always lived in a city. I've always been very grateful and lucky to be able to utilize my art form, which is dance, in search of my identity and in celebration of my identity, and also as resistance to certain elements of my identity as well. I grew up on Ngunnawal, Ngambri country in Canberra. I've lived in Sydney for 12 years on Gadigal country, where I was a dancer, senior artist, choreographer for Bangarra Dance Theatre for 12 years. I lived in Naarm, where I worked at Ilbidjeri Theatre Company, where Wes has also worked at Ilbidjeri before, with the incredible Rachel Mazza. And now I very, very luckily live here on Ghana Yada, where I lead Australian Dance Theatre, which is the oldest ongoing contemporary dance company in this country. And this year we're celebrating 60 years as the elder of contemporary dance. And I'm very, very privileged to be leading the company at this time. And I'm also the very first First Nations artistic director to lead that company as well. And so I guess where I come from a place of unknown. I come from a place of not a completely blank piece of paper, but a piece of paper that has maybe sat in the earth for a very long time, and I'm now just understanding it and trying to find my way into what that is, to reclaim what got me to here and to have a deeper understanding of what got me to here, and then taking what I now know and what I'm learning forward for my children, and to be really proud of where we've come, but also of where we're going.
How many children do you have?
I have 2. I have an 8-year-old son, Archie, and a 3-year-old daughter, Billy.
And some more coming?
No.
I'm all for the breeding program.
Yes, we've had this conversation before.
More children.
More children now? Anyway, let's not go there. Yes.
Rachel,
yes.
just about where you come from, and how that defines you.
Well, on the family side, my mother's people emigrated here in the 1880s, came to South Australia, Prussia, coming through Prussia. unfortunately, they went to the unglamorous area of the farmlands. So they weren't in the glamorous hills. They were out in the hard country around Veitch, around that area, and worked as farmers on the family property. And my mum grew up one of 10 kids, you know, working and living on the farm, and then, yeah, eventually came into Adelaide. I met my dad. My dad has mixed ancestry. His great-grandmother, Neliaraka, was involved in a massacre, was one of the few survivors of a massacre. She fled the massacre from a place called Blackfellas Bones, aptly named, east of Alice Springs, so she's an Aranda woman. Fled, found a haven with an Irish miner, which is where we get the name Perkins. They had 2 kids. One of those children, Hetty, is my grandmother, my father's mother. My father was born to Kalkadoon man and her, my nana, and he was born in a native institution in Alice Springs that was locally called the Bungalow, and then came to Adelaide as a young boy, bought by Father Smith, was put in a school here called St Francis House, which some of you will be familiar with, and then met my mother. Sparks flew, romance was born, and then I was born. I'm the 3rd child of, those 2, Charlie and Eileen.
And if there was a story that kind of defines where you are now, what would that be? Was there a story that you can point to and go, this is something that I hold really clear about, something that's helped you get to where you are now?
Related to my family or
could be
professionally or just a
Could be anything, yeah, any story.
Ooh. Well, that's a big question. I suppose that my upbringing in that family, both from my mother and my father, really inspired me to try and make a contribution in public life in some way, and filmmaking became that journey or whatever tool because of the stories that I was aware that weren't told, you know, the stories that were a blank when I was growing up at school, that many of us, because most of us the same age, wouldn't have got much of an education about Aboriginal history, culture or anything at school. And I saw that vacuum and I thought, well, film, this is a way that I can. And my friends and colleagues up the back here who were at CAMA, the Central Australian Aboriginal Media Association, back in the 80s, which was like the Motown of Australia, wasn't it, Bill? Bill Davis was there. Yeah. He set up the recording studio, set up the first albums that came out of CAMA, and we had a little television studio there as well. That's where I got my first traineeship. So I suppose the absence of stories was what defined my career, because Frida Glynn, who set CAMA up, sorry, I'm taking a bit long, but no. Frida Glynn, who set it up, said, you know, this is what we're going to do. We're going to take control of this medium of film and television, and you kids, you're going to go out there and you're going to be the conduits for these stories to be told, and we're going to put our stories on what was then satellite television and, you know, get our stories out. And that's what I've been doing ever since I was an 18-year-old girl. Just having a little bit of a pause now, though. Doing something else for a minute. Yes.
But I think that's really instructive too when you think about the power of the 67 referendum that then brought about so many changes in the 70s. I note the idea too that in the early 70s with the development of the legal services, the medical services, housing, education services that were run by us, that we've seen a whole range of things coming through in a very self-determined way, and that we had control over our own story at that point. And it's no accident that, you know, Black Theatre Redfern comes up at exactly the same time.
Absolutely.
That telling stories has both a cultural but also a political purpose as we go through.
And I think that's what's made our storytelling vital and interesting, and it's certainly what gets me out, what did get me out of bed before I became lazy the last little while, that motivational force of the power of the stories that we're telling and needed to be told, the urgency, the need, the vacuum that we were filling. It was a great motivating force for our storytelling, and it really found an audience. Like, how I was saying, no one's going to turn up, because back in the early days, no one did turn up, right? We ran little film festivals, no one would come, And now, of course, it's blossomed and people are interested, and there's a much greater desire for our country to understand this history and culture and things that we have been denied, that are at the heart of Australian identity, or should certainly be.
And I think we'll come back to this theme.
Yes,
it
sorry,
feels
I'm
like
going too much.
No, you never talk too much. I love
do.
I love you. I love the way you talk. I love your work. And I think that there's a real sense that we don't praise each other enough.
That's enough, though.
Okay.
Because you make me shame. I'm getting all shame.
All right.
But thank you. I don't mean to be ungrateful.
No, you're right, love. I should praise you now, shouldn't I?
Yeah,
you
you've
love
got to
me,
praise him
Wesley?
now. That's right, yeah.
I felt the expectation.
I'm
That's
just waiting
right.
for your love, Wesley.
Oh, the love's here for you. This whole idea that often our storytelling is part of our cultural continuity. When we talked before about the story not being told, the absence of story, but in our private lives, in our family lives, the stories get told again and again and again, and wonderful stories. A quick little sidebar. So, Udru Nunakul, Kath Walker, I call her my great aunt, who surprisingly or not surprisingly had a very powerful political son, Dennis Walker, and then Uncle Vivian Walker, who was a very powerful storyteller and artist. And I remember her telling me the story of the 67 referendum, and she sat down with Holt and where it was going in the lodge.
Yes, she did.
And they talked and they talked and they talked. And at the end of the day, and the story goes that she said that the butler came in and said, Prime Minister, the dinner's going to be served.
Yes. Do you want a drink?
Do you want a drink? You heard the story?
Yes,
Here
it's
we
a
go.
very famous, beautiful story. You tell it.
Oh, well, I'll tell the story that she told me.
Yeah.
And there she is with a smoke in her holder, and saying, and then said, Kath, would you like a drink? And she told me, and I never touch the stuff. Bullshit.
Yeah.
But
Remember, this is being televised live.
Oh,
just to say out to the people, so no swearing. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. No.
Okay.
Joking.
But the idea is she took the drink and then broke down what it meant in every state and territory to receive alcohol as an Aboriginal person. And the story then goes that was the moment that Holt decided that, yes, we need to back this referendum. And what is it about telling a story, whether it's true, whether it's not true, whether it's embellished or not, there's something about the heart of it that's shared. And I didn't realise you knew that story too, but it's that thing that we tell in our family because that was something that was really important to us. Sorry, Daniel, I've kind of...
No, but there's something really beautiful about that idea of telling a story, because if you're telling it to someone. And so you should always listen twice as much as you speak. So the idea of telling someone a story, whether it's via your words or via film or via my chosen art form, which is the physical language and the body and dance, is that there is a meeting point between two people. And so this space is the interconnected space. This is where shared identity, shared empathy, an idea of connectedness happens in that moment of telling a story. And stories have the power to define. They have a power to define identity. They have a power to define history. They have a power to place you somewhere here on Ghana. Like, there are stories that place you here and only here because they are deeply connected to place. And so the idea of storytelling, I think, is always a shared experience.
Well, and let's challenge this, because that we know the person-to-person storytelling, but in fact there's also person-to-place, person-to-land, that understanding story of place is very important to that.
Absolutely, and this is something that I'm also really interested in too, is this idea of, and it came from Professor Margot Neal from the National Gallery of Australia, and she talks about this idea of being able to walk barefoot on your ancestral country. You have access to 75,000 years of an archive. That the stories come up from the land through the soles of our feet into our body. And obviously the idea of that treasure trove of stories coming into our bodies of like, wow, like this, I have an infinite number of stories that I want to tell in my body. And how we access an archive and how we share those and when we share those, you know,
I've got a story. I was talking to an uncle about this. That why is it like now I'm living on country? This notion of there's so many birds, and they're very noisy, and this kind of and he said, well, you share DNA with those birds, and I go, how's that work? And he goes, well, if you think about 60,000 or more thousand years of your ancestors being buried in there and growing, you know, the DNA then going into the grasses and the trees. And my grandfather's buried. We always knew where he was buried because this massive gum tree was always at the head of his grave. And we said, that's our grandfather. That tree is our grandfather. Wow. And this sense of a DNA connection. And, you know, when I hear wonderful stories of farmers who say about the 5 generations connected to land, which is beautiful, and they get a really strong sense of that. And you go, yes, well, imagine what 50,000 generations feels like. What does that look like?
Yeah, wow.
And that the DNA of your ancestors is in everything around you. How powerful is that?
Extraordinary. It's such an intrinsic connection to somewhere, and how that influences who we are, how we exist, how we see the world. It's in our cells, in the marrow of our bones. Like, it's a really, and I've never had, as I said, I've never had the privilege of living on country. I've visited and I've toured my work there, and I get to connect with country more and more every time I go back, and I see different things in different seasons, and learning my language very slowly and being able to understand all of those things. And again, I'm understanding my connection to that place via stories, from my elders and from my very extended kinship network, and they're just incredible kind of moments to savor, that places me somewhere that I've never had that before.
And Deb, right, in some of her notes, and please excuse me, there's notes to some of the questions I posed to Deb, so I'll dip into them, where she talked about the idea of sharing country with strangers who don't know story of country. You know, she's talking about you're sitting side by side with people who haven't got the same understanding of place and what that means for your narrative and your story. And and at one point she says here, the walls, living within the walls, and to travel on country. And I struggled to breathe, living so close to others who were strangers, who I had no kinship with. And going, in many ways, our storytelling is about building kinship and connection. I mean, Rachel, you've been doing this for decades. Can I say decades?
Yes. Yes, that is a fact. Yes, it's okay.
It's a fact. The truth is always right.
Yeah.
Unless it's a Trump truth. Anyway, that's another story. But this notion of going, a lot of your work is about bringing those stories to the fore, things that have been suppressed or oppressed or forgotten. And this notion of filmmaking being a cultural continuity as well. Whereas before we might sit around a campfire and tell a story. There is an unbroken line from that oral tradition to the filmmaking that you do now.
Yeah, and I think that's, you know, when I was talking about Frida Glynn, and there's a whole bunch of other people, senior Indigenous people who, you know, were in that cohort with her, but they really understood that the format of filming would be really appropriate, particularly for people who have come from an oral history tradition, and that fluidity and oratory that comes with having to, remember extensive song cycles and memories, and have traditions passed down orally, which makes you really adept and basically like a walking encyclopedia of knowledge, that would translate really well to the form of video where people could just talk all this knowledge into the camera in a fluid way. And so they identified very quickly that this was going to be a form that would really work within that traditional context of storytelling and knowledge transmission. And so it did. We would make films, we would record people for hours and hours and hours and hours. And I've continued that actually practice. So when I do documentaries, I'll interview someone for sometimes 6 hours or over a couple of days, which is very unusual because, well, I also see it as not just that fluid, traditional sort of knowledge that I was talking about before, but it's an archive of a person, and it goes into this fabulous place we call the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, which has the biggest collection of Indigenous material in the world, and it's going to sit there and be a memory for the future. And so storytelling has many purposes for me. It's the purpose now that the audience sees, but it's the purpose that their generations will look at those films and they'll look at those people and the rushes and interviewed, the families will look at it. So it's something that has a benefit now, but also hopefully has a legacy into the future.
You work in documentary, you work in feature films, you work in a range of ways. Do you see them as all the same, or you see them as very different, a different focus? When you're doing a documentary, that's a different thing to doing a feature film, say.
Yeah, they're different forms of the same, wheelhouse. That's one of the benefits of being an Aboriginal filmmaker, that you do get, you're able to work across different genres in a way that other filmmakers are sometimes more pigeonholed. I think documentary I find very compelling. Sometimes it's looked down on as the poor cousin to the, the drama and the flash, big budget stuff. But actually, documentary, some of the work I've done in documentaries I'm most proud of, it's much more difficult than drama. And you're carrying the weight of someone's story and their people's community story. Like Lee Garter, my good friend, is here tonight in the audience. There she is. And she worked on First Australians with me, and it took 7 years to make that show. And Lee went through the whole pictorial archive of Australia from 1770 through to 1993, looking for piecing together, the pictorial records of all these different stories we were telling. So that the reality of trying to tell those stories, the truth that you're trying to convey, the responsibility that you're carrying to tell that story and do it well, can be both a great privilege but a terrible burden, because you worry, you want to do it right, you want to do it well, you want to represent the people, you want to get it to an audience, to actually get them to watch it. Sometimes these very hard stories, you have to try and find a way. That's where the craft comes in. Find the craft in the storytelling that will bring the people with you, bring the audience with you. That's the great challenge when we tell these difficult stories, is to bring an audience along on the journey with you. So documentary is challenging in that way. It can be very challenging, but it's bears so much fruit because, it's like the truth is so compelling.
Well, we'll come back to truth-telling, because I think that's such an important way of storytelling into the future as well, and what its purpose might be. But Daniel, just coming to you now, this idea too of this continuity of practice, dance being, a very clear kind of way of embodying and telling story, connecting to country, and that idea that I know with Tracker, where you were telling a family story as well, the importance of that cultural continuity for you.
Yeah. As I said, when I opened, I said the dance is, whether I chose dance or it chose me, maybe we'll figure out later, but dance as a form just speaks to me. There's something about it being, and this is the title of my new show, called A Quiet Language. It's a quiet language. The body, two bodies sharing space, can say an infinite amount of things, can say so much, and it's my belief that it can connect to something deeply intellectual, but also instinctual and emotional. at the same time. And that is something that I really look for in the work that I make. What is the body saying? And Wesley mentioned my work Tracker, and that was about exploring and celebrating the life of my great-great-uncle, who was a black tracker with the New South Wales Police Force. His name was One Night the Moon. His name was Uncle Alec Riley. Where I was going is, coincidentally, Rachel Perkins directed the film called One Night the Moon, which was about my great-uncle Alec. And that's just hit me just now. And that was about, that film was one of the stories of Uncle Alec, about Desmond Clark, the young boy. Incredible film. If you haven't seen it, please do go and see it. But the story with my Uncle Alec was just looking at, again, what stories were told about him at the time. So all the newspaper articles at the time were obviously written by non-First Nations people. So therefore, they were written via one lens. But when I talked to my elders and the stories that they were told, and my aunties who knew Uncle Alec, they lived on the mission with him. They were taught and served food by him and told off by him. And a couple of the uncles were taught how to track by him. They were like, no, don't read the newspaper articles. This is what actually really happened. And so again, there's always a really interesting thing about the context, like who's telling the story. There's a great power in being that storyteller. And so there is a great responsibility in that. And so through that, telling Uncle Alec's story, what I loved about that experience, and I worked on that with Rachel Mazza, who's the outgoing artistic director of Ilbidgery, is that I wanted to know what needs to be said versus what needs to be felt. What did I want you as an audience to feel in the audience? And then what did I need you to just know? Really black and white and blunt. What did I need you to know versus what I need you to feel? And so it's kind of looking at various forms of storytelling, and diving into Uncle Alec's world was the second work that I've made that directly responded and directly opened a door for me to interrogate my identity and to interrogate my belonging. Who am I? Where did I come from? What do I connect back to? And my first work was about my cousin Michael Riley, who's a visual artist. And then this one was about Uncle Alec, and then there'll be more and more. And so I think that storytelling and that continuity of it, as a fair-skinned, tattooed, urban living blackfella who I have the great kind of double side of the coin. I can not be racially vilified, but yet I can walk into an Aboriginal community and not be seen as mob. And so that's just one of those things that I carry. But how do I find that meeting point to tell my story in a really honest and raw way? And for me, again, leading back to the continuity, and this kind of really feeds into my current work, A Quiet Language, and my role as AD at ADT, I really clearly and really respectfully I can turn around and I can look upstream. And upstream of me, I can see Wesley, I can see Rach, I can see Rachel Mazza, I can see the black leaders, artistic elders who have opened doors and channels and ways of storytelling for my generation. And so for me, the continuity is acknowledging and respecting that, and then making sure the river in front of me is wider for people, for the next generation, like my children, to be able to be fierce in their storytelling ability, and that they have a self-determination and a power and a resistance as well to tell the story that they want to tell in their way. So for me, it is about that. That's the thread, a river or a line in the sand, however it is, whatever the analogy is you want to think about. For me, it's a river. I can see it really clearly, and I talk a lot about canoes and when I first joined ADT, we all have to be in the same canoe going the same way. And I think that's a beautiful analogy as well, for multiple things as well.
Well, I think, Rachel, you just got auntied then, so...
Yeah, I was going to say, it's like he calling me an elder because
I think it is.
I'm not an elder yet. Not an elder, definitely not an elder. I'm middle-aged, come on.
Yeah, all right, Auntie Rachel. Just to say something that Deb talks about too is she talks about the ability for Aboriginal folk to tell stories through new media, and that reflects the changing times. It's critically important to explore and develop ways to make these new technologies work for us, that we're not caught in a vitrine, kind of in a museum, that we observed as something that is historical, that somehow was trapped through the colonial project there, that we are in fact adapting all the time, and that we use these new technologies It doesn't make us less because of that. As I see Auntie there grab her mobile phone. All cultures and
She's not
communities.
an auntie either.
Oh, is she Auntie yet?
Sister girl.
Okay. But she talks, Deb also says, I think that our embracing of these new technologies as Aboriginal people simply characterises the world in which we live now. I do not believe that Aboriginal people live in two worlds. I think we too live in one world, except our worlds have extremes in that living. Those extremes of living become more exotic because of the non-access of many non-Aboriginal people about those stories. How do you access them? How do you get to them? And that I think we're hearing from both our speakers here, this sense of the invitation and the access in a very safe way to those stories is part of what we do. We could talk forever, and I'm going to move us into some tricky territory around truth-telling. The idea that the storytelling world that we're moving into now, hopefully, if we talk about what the Uluru Statement from the Heart said about, the voice treaty truth, voice truth treaty.
Voice treaty truth.
Thank you very much. I kept seeing these three as like a fishing spear with the three prongs, that you catch the fish, but you need the one spear to do it with. And there's kind of constant idea of the truth-telling being important. Can I put it out there that I think we didn't see as much of that truth-telling during the referendum discussion? That there was a lot of misinformation and lack of information or misdirection, which has been a very strong political technique that we've seen rise in the last, let's call it, few years. The challenging question here, Rachel, is did we not hold on to the storytelling strongly enough during that period of time? And did that storytelling get corrupted in that process?
Well, what we know from the data is that, and no offence to anybody here in the room, but the younger you were, the more likely you were to vote in favour of the referendum question. And I think that reflects a couple of things, but our education system, primarily the people like me, my age, who just missed out on any education and didn't understand the context. And what we also know is that majority of Australians don't understand that First Nations people are the most impoverished and disadvantaged of any group in our country, right? So they're not even aware that there's sort of a problem and not really engaged in that issue because it doesn't affect them. So those are just some hard stats that we found. I think it's true to say that we weren't prepared for the level of misinformation, but also it was very hard to challenge that misinformation because it was so overwhelming, because we had a number of media outlets, Murdoch Press, who were really heavily on the no side, and but then whenever anyone else reported on it, they had to give both sides. So we had this sort of strange journalistic value of presenting both sides all the time in a very skewed sort of situation where we have, conglomerate media ownership in this country. But interestingly, there was such a lot of information too passing through social media, which is just now our reality, right? And it was very hard to challenge that because it's just, it's everywhere, It's something you cannot contain. It's not something necessarily you can respond to because it's happening in channels just everywhere. And we see that in the world. I went to a rally here in Adelaide during the campaign, and literally a woman stood up and said, this referendum is about property rights and they are going to take your homes. So when you leave here, go home and check your title deeds to your house, right? And I was standing there watching them say that and other things like that. And I felt just like, there were people that thought that their children weren't going to be able to go to the private schools because Aboriginal kids would take all of the places in private schools. So there's a lot of things happening in multilingual communities misinformation. So look, it was unanticipated, the misinformation. So stories can be extremely compelling in that way as well, when they spark something and it just travels like wildfire, and it's hard to get on top of because it's a story that's just is a lightning rod, and it just moves through people and communities. So
there's something about how, if you've got an feeling deep in your guts of discomfort. And it was very interesting, if you don't know, vote no. Remember that conversation? I heard this kind of I heard the roll of everyone's eyes as I said it. But this idea of saying, not if you don't know, how do you ask, how do you connect? And this idea of story being a very, very vital part of that.
Yeah, there was also misinformation on the Indigenous side. Not wanting to go on it too much, but there was a lot of misinformation on the Indigenous side as well about that this will undermine sovereignty, it will take away your rights, you'll be branded, the R for recognise is a brand, you'll be branded as a slave to some, weird conspiracy that, Jews are all going to run the world, and it's, this stuff was all on Facebook. And, in a vacuum, people believed it. So, some people. So, that's the modern times, though, that we're in now, and people don't trust mainstream media anymore either. They have a really low level of trust for mainstream media. What they trust is they trust the person that they're talking to, their fellow people. And so if that person says they are going to take your homes, they're coming for your property, you're more likely to believe them than an article in the Sydney Morning Herald. Actually, a lot of people. The distrust now, the thing of fake news, is really through our society in a way that it has never been before, I think. Well, not ever before, but,
Well, I'm interested that we've moved from tribes and clans based on geography or maybe even ethnicity, like where you are, to kind of almost an algorithmic tribalism of people who are agreeing with us, and and we might all be very like-minded in this room on many things, but we're also allowed to disagree about things as well.
I was with a writer just today at the Writers' Festival, very quickly, Wesley, his name was, and he talked about the fact, exactly this point, that being isolated, you don't have any accountability when you're isolated because you're just talking to your own people and they don't check your views, they challenge you, right? So the public square of storytelling, conversation, in these situations, we talk to each other, we're like, oh, well, you challenged me, and I'm like, oh, well, yeah, maybe that's right, or maybe I was wrong about that, and it's a place where you are held accountable. He said it in the most beautiful way for people who were there. I can see a few people agreeing. And there was really that sense that I felt, yes, these are why these conversations are important, where we come together and we talk about things, because actually it knocks the edges off us and we find out, we test our ideas and we tell stories and we work out the world together.
And perhaps even by telling the story, you get a deeper sense of what your psychological motivators are. Is it all right to say, actually, I really worry that the home that I've built for my family will be taken away. You're more likely to get taken away by the bank, but
Yeah, well, that's right. You can test those ideas.
You test them.
Right.
You go, actually, Aboriginal people, I've seen your lazy ass home. I don't want it. No. I live on an island. I don't want your dusty fork home.
Well, it's got no relation to property. It's like
exactly
a
right.
amendment.
But if that's a fear, it was interesting. I talked to a
fear.
geographer in the Netherlands, and they talked about this idea of what is the national metaphor of the Netherlands, and they said it was about water. That we work out communication and cooperation through water. I give you the water from my land, because I need to get it moved, and you take it from that, and I trust that you can move it, and that water becomes the national metaphor. What is the national metaphor of Australia? And the conversation that turned into, is it actually the fence? Is the fence the national metaphor of this country? Is the story we tell about how we separate ourselves from each other? Is the national metaphor actually about extraction? What we can get from each other, what we can get from country? Or is the national metaphor one of fire? Fire as a tool of farming, fire as renewal, fire as destruction. And we need to work out what our national metaphor is so that we can build a storytelling around that. I'm going to come to you, Daniel.
The fence is a really interesting metaphor because then we're just continuing to box ourselves into our place, and then we build high fences and we don't look over the fence. So therefore, like you said, Rach, we're rattling around in our own minds, and then obviously with the access of social media too, we're just that's how we connect to someone 3 houses down who thinks like-minded to me.
But let's say also the fence is one of comfort. It's like a cow press.
Safety.
It holds you, and kind of you can feel like it's containable.
Yeah, and that's where, and when I was hearing Rach speak, like it made me think about the power of something like this, of storytelling in this way, in gathering, in coming together, in whether that be in protests or whether that be in large forums or something like this, or it's art, it's storytelling, it's gathering in a theatre, it's at an art gallery, it's actually finding the stories that hit an emotion, because also a lot of that rhetoric that happened through the referendum obviously hit emotion. It hit something emotional and intellectual that lit a fire, and then that fire was never going to be put out.
Well, I argue that the fire was always there, and something threw fuel on it. Because can I say in this company, let's accept that this country has a very checkered past with racism at its very core, and that we do need to actively address that through our storytelling and our building of a nation. And that, see, I let that go too.
Yeah.
But that's not something that should be used as a big stick. It should be used as an invitation to conversation. Going, I'm totally prejudiced. I'm prejudiced against people who don't wear socks.
Clearly.
So, where's that natural prejudice come from? Where's it come? I'm sure it comes from the whole idea. It's the reason I clean my house. It was taught to me by my grandmother because she was always worried that her 12 kids would be taken away from her. And we build up this psychological profile that stories kind of make us who we are. And if we think about narrative therapy, if those who know enough about narrative therapy, this idea of what are the stories that form us early, that keep us in that locked sense of who we are, it's only until you find the new story that you can find a new way forward. Daniel, coming to you. I was going to just, Deb says this, she says it beautifully. I think truth-telling must be cognizant that there are many players present in the motivating event. Truth-telling is not something that occurs through a singular voice or perspective, or through the loudest voice of a telling. And she's reminded me of this idea that in South Africa with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they talked about multiple perspectives, multiple truths that can coexist. They talked about the personal truth, the truth you believe to be true, the idea of a forensic truth, the truth that can be proved through science or, is factual and logical. This idea of a kind of let's say an official truth, a truth that has been told to us, and then also a healing truth, a truth of a story that needs to be told to bring all of those truths together under one. And it's interesting that we had a reconciliation commission, but not a truth and reconciliation commission, and that truth-telling can heal. I mean, you told the story of your great uncle and your cousin, the idea that by telling those truths, what motivates you to tell those particular stories?
I guess first and foremost for me, it's a fascination to start with, and then the deeper I go into some of these stories, it's what drives me is actually, and I agree, there are multiple truths can coexist. But what is that truth of in that? The context, I think, is a really important thing as well. But I guess what drives me to tell these stories is that these are stories that should be told and need to be told. And again, they are moments that can happen between an audience or people and humans. It's a human-to-human exchange, and that is where narratives can be questioned, where narratives can be sold, where they can be dismissed. And it's a really interesting space for me, especially with being able to uncover and tell, obviously, black stories.
Well, and often writing onto the public record that neglected story, that if the only writers of history, if, what do they say? History is written by the victor.
Yeah.
But if that's the only story that we're hearing, if that's the only writing that we're reading, writing in its broadest sense, that we're reading, then we're not getting the bigger picture, we're not getting the bigger story. And the more we understand that complexity, the more interesting we are as a nation, I suspect. God, we could go on forever. I do want to move us into the future and go, what are the obstacles? I'm going to come to you, Dan. What are the obstacles of us telling the story of the world that we want? If we think that as artists, as storytellers, we imagine and create a vocabulary for a future that we want, what's stopping us from doing that, do you think?
Oh, that's tough. What's stopping us from doing those things?
What do you need to do more of it?
I guess agency in wanting to tell our stories our way.
And who's going to give you that agency?
Oh, that's a good question.
It's a trick question.
That is a trick question, Wesley.
Can it be given to you by anyone else but yourself, is the question.
Well, no, that's right. And I think the stories that you choose to tell, or the stories that I choose to tell, will always be told in the way that they need to be told at that time. And then I would just hope that when those stories are told, that they're viewed or received with an open heart. Because ultimately this meeting, again, I keep coming back to the meeting of exchange, not transaction, exchange, is this open-heartedness to understand and to, as you said, write into public records. And again, like as Deborah said, like using our contemporary forms that we have, because we are contemporary artists. And we have to be utilising those forms to continue to morph and shape and to celebrate our stories now. Like, yes, we can tell stories 75,000 years, but our stories, our contemporary stories, are just as relevant because they speak to who we are now, who I am now, walking with no socks on Ghana Yada is just as important, right?
Yeah.
Because that is, again, that cultural continuity of story.
Well, and having been, am I older? Oh, anyway.
Yes. Not that there's anything wrong with being older. I'm quite happy to be my age, but you are.
But having seen this cycle again and again, isn't it terrible that we get
I don't know whether
close?
you are.
I don't know. I'm old enough. But when you get close to change, when the hopes, the dreams get close, you feel people's discomfort, and then you feel like there's always backward movement. And how do we keep the forward movement in this kind of progressive thing can be difficult for me. Be that, people find, let's say the right-wing media or the media as a whole, find drama in fear. And so you feel like it just gets pushed back again. And that's not just Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, but it's a whole range of kind of more progressive thought. Rachel, coming to you, what are the stories that need to be told to help the country reckon with its history, realise its full potential?
I think we're at a pivotal moment in this country. It's an incredibly important election, this one. And the fact that the potential incoming Prime Minister has declared that he will not stand in front of an Aboriginal flag. Now, what does that say about our preparedness to accept the story of this country? If the leader of the country will not, that simple gesture, acknowledge the deep story of this country in that symbol, in that flag.
And let's just say he is not the Prime Minister of this country.
Well, what I'm about to say is that we need to ensure that that doesn't happen, right? And, and I ask you, I'm not a person who knows how to be involved in politics, but we must make whatever best efforts we can in the next probably 35 days, when the election's called probably on Monday and Tuesday, or Tuesday, probably Tuesday. We have 33 days after that, and we are on this pivot. You know, if he will not stand in front of an Aboriginal flag as our Prime Minister, it will be a very difficult road for our people, and it will be a very difficult situation for all those schools, and all those hospitals, and all those universities that finally, proudly fly the flag, that national flag. What did we ask the kids? Oh, take down the flags, put them away. You know, if we can't fly an Aboriginal flag in this country, then how can we tell the story of this country? So it's with us now, right now, and that will define our immediate future. So that's the story that I would like you to tell to people, to go out and talk about the importance of this moment, and talk to the people you care about, and talk to the people in your workplace, and be the most persuasive you can, so that we can not go down that very dark path of division and conflict that is being stirred by that man.
Hear, hear. Dan, I'm coming to you about the humanity and future, and hopefully a very positive one as well. This notion of what do you imagine is the story that you will tell your children, that you hope they tell, if they have children, their children?
Wow, that's hard to follow, Rachel. No, extraordinary.
It's heavy. Well, but also it says to us, we are empowered to tell the story. It doesn't just get told to us. We then are responsible for the telling of it. And this is such a Aboriginal kind of way of working, isn't it? You tell me a story, I tell a story, it comes back to you some way as well. But it actually says you're empowered to do it, which you don't feel very empowered half the time in discourse.
Yeah, I mean, I think as storytellers, we have a privileged position, and it is the great privilege to try and give back to the country something that has been denied them. That is a great privilege, and we've all had that opportunity through the wonderful support that the Australian government does give the arts, actually, and filmmaking and dance and theatre, to express that. And if there's something positive, it's been the blossoming of the art forms in which Indigenous people are now in those spaces and leading and creating some of the great work of this country. So that is a positive thing. That is a great thing for our country. And I think storytelling, you know, sometimes you think, does it really make a difference? You know, we're just putting on this little show. Is anyone going to watch it? Is anyone going to actually engage?
People turn up.
Will people turn up? Does anyone care? But I think, you know, there's a ripple effect and it goes out, and you can't measure hearts and minds very often in this country. You measure them at an election. You know, you measure them at certain moments, but you can't tell how many people you're necessarily impacting. But I think stories have that way of connecting emotionally with people in a profound way, and that's the great gift of the arts, that it connects emotionally with people. And I tell myself that has value and that what we're doing is worth it. And I think in years to come, as all these kids grow up who watch our stuff and read our work and go to the theatre, that will bear fruit for our country, so that maybe we have a referendum in another 20 years' time and we'll see a change. We'll see a change.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think for the future generation, again, I think of Archie and Billy, and for them to look back, to be looking upstream at me and my generation now, to see, okay, well, what steps forward were they making? And then how can I make those steps leaps? And to look at the gaps. That's something that I hope for sure. Like, I hope for another referendum. I hope to see it. But I think that next generation that's on the way, I think the empowerment of them, again, the sharing of knowledge with them, the giving them the right tools to be able to tell the stories that can shape a nation, and that, again, this battle of the heart and the mind has always been a thing here in Australia. To give our next generation the tools and the empowerment to shape a future for this country, I think, is something that I think about a lot, and because I always think about what my kids see when they come to my work. What do you see? What does it make you feel? Like, ask those questions of them. But it is and I agree with you, Rachel, we are at a critical point.
I'm going to bring Deb into the conversation here, and she writes, my second book, Terra Glossia, is due to be released in July. And it is not like we come with this place, which is her first book. She says, Terra Glossia is a slow-moving conversation about the unidentified cargo that accompanied Cook when he landed on the shores of Gadigal country, English language and its inherent ways of meaning-making. We do not often consider the underlying mechanisms of language. It is mostly vocabulary that we focus on, and what the rules are, and in the use of the vocabulary set. Terra Glossia steps beyond the words that create a language and considers the why and how of communicative form and ways in which meaning is made. What happens when concepts and behaviours exist in one culture but cannot be articulated because the language of the dominant culture does not have the words for it? The limitations of this very language we're talking about. And when you're saying about this idea of the feeling, the instinct, the emotion, the body with the intellect and how they work together, and that these words we use are just, one way of kind of communicating, but there's so many other ways on that very deep and human level. If you can believe it, we've been talking for an hour, and it's been such a fascinating kind of hour of conversation and debate. Dan, this notion of storytelling as important, what's the one thing you imagine into the future that you will be doing to continue the work that you're doing that you really want to push?
Hopefully I'm still telling stories, and I'm still uncovering truths and raising them up, empowering, as I said, our next generation through every art form that we have as the older storytellers of this place. So I hope that we can still continue to tell the stories, the hard stories, the sad stories, the stories that make us feel, and the stories that bring us together, to find a commonality here. But ultimately, it is those truth-telling stories that need to happen, because unless we reckon with those, there is no acknowledgement of where we're going.
Well, and the flip side of that is how the audience needs to also engage in the sad and the happy and the uncomfortable and the intrinsically questioning the status quo, because the stories may not always be the things that are easy to hear along the way. Rachel, Australian Wars, can I just talk about that for a quick second? Wasn't that, has everyone seen Australian Wars? Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
For those who haven't had the chance, you want to quickly just tell us what that is and where we can see it.
It's a 3-part documentary series that's on SBS. So it's on SBS On Demand. You can see it there for the next 7 years. But don't take that long. I encourage you to see it sooner than that. Yeah.
And it's an incredible, when we talked about truth-telling and we talk about the discomfort, we don't grow if we just live in a comfortable state of being. We grow because we push ourselves beyond those limits.
I should answer your question, sorry. So it's a documentary series that charts frontier warfare that is sometimes described as from sort of 1788 across the continent, right up to, say, the 1920s. So it's in 3 hours, and it's got dramatised bits in it, and 60 historians and lots of descendants talking about it, and so it's a television documentary series. Sorry,
and it has multiple perspectives of it as well. Like it took 5 years to make that show, and so it was quite an effort, and it sort of put me off filmmaking. Why? Why did it put you off filmmaking?
It was so full on making it. I mean, it was so full on making it. It was so hard making it, and to start, just to try and put 120 years of warfare across an entire continent in a ridiculously tiny amount of television, you know, with ads every 3 minutes, 7 minutes. You know, it's very hard to do justice to that story in a very limiting way that television is. You know, it's just too short and it's too small to tell all those experiences of that huge, you know, story. So you just feel like you're not going to do justice to it from the outset. But I think actually we put that in the film. We sort of said, we don't think we're going to do justice to this story, but, you know, this is just a slight, you know, graze of the story. But so, yeah, it's just, it was very, very difficult story to tell. But of course you can't feel like that because actually, you know, you're making a television series. You're not out there being shot down by the native police. So you can't feel like poor me, you know, because actually the stories you're telling are so full on and intense, and the violence and, you know, the great injustice, you know, the great injustice that what happened here, that still the Australian War Memorial will not come to terms with in its full scope. We're hoping they will. So, yeah, it was a very difficult story to tell, and it sort of pushed me over the edge, actually. And so now, given that Debra's talked about her book, I want to talk about my clothes that I'm making.
Dan's talking about his show.
So I'm modelling one of the shirts tonight. Not very well. which are available at WOMADelaide, because I've got a stall there. So you can come and buy a frock or a shirt. So I'm just dabbling in clothing for a minute.
Well, and can I say that that's another,
back to filmmaking,
another manifestation of storytelling?
Well, it's possibly, yes, possibly. You could stretch that bow if you wanted to.
I'm going to stretch it.
I think it's going to stretch it, yes.
We're coming to the end, and it's just been fabulous. Can I just say with both of you, what I'm feeling is very strongly that you leave a piece of yourself in every story you tell. That you, it sounds very Harry Potter when I say it like that. But, you know, there's part of you there that there's like skin in the game.
Oh, yeah, there's a
everything
lot
you
of
do.
skin in the game, yes.
Yeah.
A lot of tears, a lot of, you know, a lot of sweat and, you know, I think, yeah, it's a great privilege at the same time.
We started earlier tonight talking about how we're connected to country through leaving DNA. You know, generations and generations of our DNA in country connects us through the animals and the plants. And in many ways, you're leaving your DNA in the stories that you're making, your films and the dance and things like that. And
I think the terrible thing, though, is that in like 100 years' time, they're going to look back at the work and go, oh, my God, I can't believe they did that. So you know how we judge history? We judge people. We're like, oh, they were so old-fashioned back then. I can't believe they used the word, you know, Aborigines. You know, they'll be looking back on us going, oh, God.
Well,
that Rachel Perkins, how would she say that? So inappropriate. You know, so we're going to be judged, aren't we? Like in 100 years' time, they're going to be like, oh.
I think in the future they'll look back and go, Auntie Rachel, she was deadly.
Don't start the auntie thing.
And your great-great-great-grandchildren will talk about the work that you make because you're the telling of that story. Can you please join me in thanking Daniel Riley and Rachel Perkins
Thank you very much.
for a fantastic hour of conversation.
Thank you, Wesley.
Thank you very much.
Daniel, Wesley, Rachel, Uncle Frank, thank you so, so much. Delightful, wonderful, amazing conversation. Now, quick little comment about Planet Talks. So those of you who are going to WOMADelaide, if you haven't bought your ticket, please buy a ticket, because you can go and see Rachel, who will be in conversation with Tim Winton on... Buy a shirt. Actually, Rachel, as part of your clothing line, do you make socks? I was thinking that would make Wesley very happy. He'll buy a truckload for everyone. So, yeah, Rachel's in conversation with Tim Winton, Storytelling for Change, Saturday at 3:30. Your beautiful show, Daniel, tomorrow at 1:30?
Yes.
Yes.
Last show. So for those of you who haven't seen it, please go along. Odeon Theatre.
Oh no, it's sold out, isn't it?
It is sold out, yes.
Oh.
Oh well, suck it.
Whoops.
Sorry.
Sucked in. Did you say sucked in?
Okay.
Yes, we are sold
So
out.
inappropriate.
When might we see you? Wesley, when might we see you again?
Yeah, we've got multiple. We've got 2 more shows coming up this year. We're representing the work I made called Marrow, which was in response to the No referendum. That we're going to do a return season to Adelaide later in the year, and then also I'll be premiering a new work later in the year. And all I'll give you is that it's called Two Blood, and just keep your eyes out for that.
Good title.
Excellent. Okay, thank you everyone. See you again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.